Good morning, everybody. Welcome and thank you very much for being with us despite the timing clash. There's a World Cup game starting now, I'm told. Welcome both here in Montreal in the room and those joining online. And thank you to the technical teams and the CBD teams for all your help making this possible. Much appreciated. My name is Matthias Fichter. I'm a Media and Communications Manager for IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. We are here today to share the latest update to the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, which I trust most of you will be familiar with. It is one of the foremost tools that we have at our disposal to track the biodiversity crisis and report to the world what's happening. And the reason we're here in Montreal is to solve that, obviously. In the next 15 minutes, roughly, you will hear from two leading IUCN species experts. And then you'll have the opportunity to ask questions, which I kindly ask you to do once they're both finished speaking. First, you'll hear from Dr. Jane Smart, to my right, the director of IUCN's Center for Science and Data, which oversees many of IUCN's tools and standards, including the Red List. After Dr. Smart, we'll give the floor to Dr. David Obura, to my left, who is the chair of the IUCN Species Survival Commission's Coral Specialist Group, that's a mouthful, and also founding director of Cordio East Africa. Before we get to the Q&A, Dr. Smart will take the floor again and share some reflections on how the Red List and the update that we're hearing about today connects to the negotiations about the Global Biodiversity Framework, and then we'll take questions from the room and online. And with that, Dr. Smart, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias, and good morning to everybody. It's good to see you all here today. Thanks for taking the time. So the IUCN Red List, big challenges need really good intelligence, and that's what the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species gives us. Quite simply, it's the world's most comprehensive information source on the global conservation status of animal, fungi, and plant species. Now, despite its name, it's not just a list. It's a goldmine of information on linked to each species, where that species lives, what the threats are facing it, and what we can do about those threats, what the conservation measures are that we can take to bring about recovery of species. We know what to do very often. Now, today's update highlights some dramatic declines in the marine realm, in marine life all around the world. And I think I'm going to use the word scary, is that the marine species that we report on today are facing a perfect storm of threats, an onslaught of threats. We are seeing, and I am a scientist, I don't say this lightly, a decimation of marine life. Marine species are facing unsustainable fishing and bycatch, poaching, criminal networks, pollution, climate change, disease. And we all know, I think, how much people all around the world, whether they be rich or poor or in between, depend on marine life. We are seeing today species decline from corals to shellfish to marine mammals, and it's now a pleasure to pass to David Obura, who's going to give you some of the details there.
Thank you, Jane. Good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is David Obura. I'm the chair of the Coral Specialist Group for IUCN, and we have one of the species assessments as the highlight for release today. But it shows really, it's a flagship for what's happening with other coral species, the others that we're assessing, but also in coral reefs, a flagship system for what's happening with marine systems and ocean systems across the planet. The perfect storm that Jane just described is really an indication. It's been well documented in the IPBES global assessment, for example. Direct exploitation of 70% of this planet is really driving a lot of these species into decline. And then added on top of that, of course, you have other local pressures such as pollution from nearby populations and from shipping and so on, diseases that arise from that, and then also climate change, which is emerging rapidly as a dominant pressure in coming years. So in reassessing the coral species, we first published an assessment about 12 years ago. The improved data that we have, the more quantitative approach that we're able to apply this time. And looking forward into the future is really increasing the threat list on so many of these species over the last 10 or 12 years. And this in a time when we're investing in conservation, and shows how much more we need to do and how much more action is necessary. So this pillar coral, Dendrogyrus cylindricus, it's really a flagship species in the Caribbean. It's a beautiful, tall, columnar species. I'm from Kenya, but I studied in Miami, and I first worked on coral reefs in the Caribbean. And the species was not common, but it was really classic. You would see it everywhere. But over the last 40 years, it has been in decline, as with many corals in the Caribbean. And just as we thought we knew most of what was happening in terms of pressures, a new disease emerged about 4 years ago, the stony coral tissue loss disease. It's a terrible name. And it seems to have arisen from port dredging, from release of microbes into the marine environment, and then it's spread around the Caribbean in 4 years and is really decimating populations, and this coral in particular, but others too. So its threat status has increased from vulnerable 12 years ago when we assessed in 2008, and now it's critically endangered. This is a disease that advances over coral communities. In just a day, you can have 90 to 100 meters of progression of this disease, and people can really see this advancing very rapidly. So what can we do about it? And this is really what we hope the red list of species can really stimulate, is the actions that are necessary to reduce this decline. So that includes many conservation actions and protection, but it really means highlighting, reducing the pressures. So reducing pollution, reducing the impacts, reducing the overfishing and overexploitation that we're doing. And then, of course, addressing climate change and reducing carbon dioxide emissions as fast as we possibly can. Coral reefs are really one of the systems that are showing us the rapidity of the growth of these impacts and threats, and really highlighting the actions that we need to take to avoid these tipping points in these global systems in which we're going to risk the loss of species and ecosystems as well. So the message from corals is very dire, but it's just an indicator of the work that we need to do generally across reef ecosystems and then other marine ecosystems as well, more generally. So with that, I'll hand back to Jane.
Thank you very much, David. Coming back to the negotiations that are taking place here, then, I think you get the idea. This is a global crisis in the oceans, as well as in freshwater and on the land. And IUCN is calling for states to come together here to agree a big, ambitious plan to protect life on Earth, for the sake of that life and for the sake of all of the humans that depend on it. We need a strong, ambitious global biodiversity framework that should aim to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, or at least make concrete steps towards that reversal, and achieve a nature-positive world by 2030. And we are also very supportive of conserving 30% of terrestrial inland water, marine and coastal systems globally, on the basis that those protected areas are in the right places and well managed and protect key biodiversity areas. Now, the point I want to make about the link between the Red List and the rest of the negotiations that you're hearing about is that if we do not conserve species, the global biodiversity framework cannot succeed. Whatever else it does, whatever else those words say, whatever else the action that takes place by way of a response to those words, that policy framework, whatever else, if we don't conserve the species, then it's not going to work. In addition to 30% of the planet, and this applies to the marine realm, but it applies everywhere really, we've got to manage the whole planet sustainably. It's not just about what happens in protected areas. Coming back to the species level, we therefore are very much calling for a strong species goal and species-related targets. But at the same time, and this is where it gets a bit complicated, we need strong targets for the other levels of biodiversity as well, the ecosystem level and the genetic diversity level. So it's not simple, it's complicated. That's why it's a framework of goals and targets and a mission for 2030. The parties are here. I'll finish by saying that what we now need to see is some political will to make it all happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane and David, for these remarks. Before we get to the Q&A, just one small thing. You will have seen in the press release that we also had abalones assessed in this update and dugongs. Unfortunately, the species experts on these could not come to Montreal, and there's no hybrid option where they can speak. But they are on standby if you have questions, if you would like to do interviews with them. Come find me or email press@iucn.org, and we'll be very happy to put you in touch with experts on these particular species. So if you can, please, ask questions that our two experts are able to answer. Otherwise, we'll take the questions down and play them to experts that are not in the room right now. We're going to start in the room, and then we'll go to online. We have a little technical challenge to sort out with accredited online media and how they can ask questions, but bear with us, we'll get to you. Please state your name and your outlet and who you're addressing your question to, and our experts will answer, and you can ask questions in English or French, please. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Shakur Rathar. I am from New Delhi. I work for Press Trust of India, and I'm here as part of the Earth Journalism Network Fellowship. So my question is there a specific data, country-specific data on species loss or species which have deteriorated over these 12 years? In especially, I would be interested in countries like India. So yeah.
Yes, absolutely. We can disaggregate the global IUCN Red List to the national level, or indeed the regional level, and you can dig into the data and see what's happening in any one country, for sure, yes. So the answer to your question is yes, and those declines are taking place, albeit somewhat differentially around the whole planet. We'd have to have a sort of sidebar conversation. There's some things you can find through the website. If you'd require more in-depth analysis, we'd have to talk separately.
Hi, good morning. I'm Kelly Shaw Williams. I'm from Television Jamaica and also a part of the Earth Journalism Fellowship Program. My question is for Dr. David. In regards to your study on the coral reef decline in the Caribbean, can you say which countries, for instance, if Jamaica was a part of that study and how far-reaching the decline has been so far?
So yes, thank you. So in response to that question, yes, Jamaica was certainly part of the study. This is a global study that we did. And the way we do it is that for each species, we look at its global extent. So in this particular case, for Caribbean or Atlantic species, it's just countries in the Atlantic region, in the Caribbean. We aggregate the data to the regional level. So there were experts involved who accessed the latest information and pulled it together. Just as Jane just mentioned, this information is recorded in the species assessment sheet, and you can look to the level of detail that we had. But every country was involved, and certainly reefs in Jamaica, some of the best documented as well in the Caribbean. So it does relate very well to conditions happening in Jamaica.
Hello, everybody. My name is Enrique Andres, and I am from Peru, and I am working in Fairtrade International. So my question is, how is your work with another NGOs and governments, and which is the risk that you see in the future and the impact that you want to achieve for this? Thanks.
Could I just ask who you are addressing? Is it specifically to David about corals or more general?
More general about this list.
Sorry, could you just give me the question in a very short?
Yeah, the risk and the impacts that you see in the future. And how is your work with the NGOs and governments?
Okay, thank you. Yes. Well, IUCN is a union of member organizations, and many scientists as well, 15,000 scientists who volunteer their knowledge and support for IUCN's mission, a just world that values and conserves nature. So we're extremely engaged with the conservation community and beyond the conservation community all around the globe, with civil society generally, to work on the basis of the action that needs to be taken as a result of the information in the red list. So one of the good news pointers, I guess, that we're not talking about so much today, but I will mention now, is that when we carry out action for species, as documented in the red list, in general, conservation works. But what we need to do is to do more and to scale up and replicate the successes in every part of the world and in every realm. And where we are doing that, it works, as I say. And what we find is that most of this species recovery work is triggered by the information coming out of the IUCN Red List, which actually is good, because I have to say, the news we give you on this is often very gloomy, a little bit depressing, but it sparks a reaction, which is good. We now have the information, we can go and try and rescue such and such a species, you know, and in the release you've seen the perfect storm, but every one of those perfect storm of threats has a solution. And with the right resources and the right people that we can reach out to, then there are solutions that can be applied. And that's what that framework needs to showcase and spearhead.
If I can just add to that from what Jane responded to you just explicitly, for example, this species that we just reported, the pillar coral in the Caribbean, to do this assessment, we really had the scientists who really know the species involved, who contributed their data and did the assessment. And many of them are very strongly linked to NGOs, to government agencies, to communities on the ground as well, who can then move forward with conservation actions. So the networks that we pull together in doing these assessments are very active, engaged networks of scientists, NGOs, and others who take a lead in action afterwards as well.
Étienne Leblanc, Radio-Canada. You said I can ask a question in English, right? J'aimerais que vous donniez plus de...
So I would like to ask for more details, if you can, on marine species. At the beginning, you had strong words on your results. Could you give us more details on this? Thank you.
The decimation that we spoke about.
Thank you very much for the question. So more information on the kind of threats that these species are facing. I don't know if you've got the press release there, but we have outlined there quite a lot of these. So in the case of the abalones, you know, I'm not an abalone expert, but here we've got this, again, I'm going to use this term, perfect storm of threats: climate change, disease, and pollution. And the way the assessments are done, it does record these threats individually. So we know this. Okay, so we've now got, of the 54 abalone species, we've got nearly half of them at risk of extinction. Now, they're very desirable species for several reasons. And a lot of this is through poaching by very well organized criminal networks linked to the international drugs trade. You often find that sort of wildlife crime is linked to the same kind of illegal infrastructure as drugs and other human trafficking, for instance, and weapons trafficking. So that is causing this devastation of these species. Now, another pointer is the severe marine heat waves that we've seen, given rise to mass mortalities in some of the species. And that then exacerbates the disease vulnerability that these species face. We've found that marine heat waves also kill the algae that the abalones depend on for the food. And then you've got pollution from agricultural runoff, forming algal blooms. So that's the opposite situation. That's too much algae, if you like, and that can eliminate species. And then a further threat is the toxins from the anti-fouling paint used to paint boats, which is an entirely fixable issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Tetsuji from Kyodo News. My question to David, you said for the disease spreading, is it somehow relating to the human activities or environment destruction? And what what can we do to prevent more impact? And my question to Jen, and what is the most important element of the species target in global framework, and how they are, and also I want to know the criteria or benchmark to assess the success or failure of this global framework negotiation.
Okay, so thank you. So many diseases of marine organisms, so in coral reefs in particular, the microbial community in seawater is very diverse, and the science is only just beginning to work on that, looking at the microbiome, they call it. But what we often see is that many terrestrial microbes or soil particles and so on will enter the sea because of rivers and disturbance on land, because of construction, shipping and port activities as well. And then, of course, these might change or mutate or evolve in these new conditions. And many of the diseases or syndromes that we see on corals can be related to these sort of novel microbes that appear in reef systems. This particular one, the stony coral tissue loss disease, seems to have come from being associated with South Florida and dredging activities. So that's really releasing sediments that have sat in place, for decades perhaps, with a lot of toxins and chemicals from industrial activity. And then modeling shows that it's spreading around the Caribbean with the currents or with shipping paths and things like that. So there's we're changing the boundaries on ecosystems. We're breaking down the boundaries, and there's interactions between people and nature becoming that much more complex because of that. And so a lot of marine diseases are emerging because of this imbalance, is what the science is beginning to point towards.
Yeah, thanks. So coming on to the second part of your question, what's our benchmark? Now, the red list can also be used as an indicator to monitor changes in the status of biodiversity over time. And many of you perhaps have heard of the red list index or the red list indicator. And what this does is sort of irons out any changes in the discovery of new species or the changing of names and so on, and monitors genuine change of status of groups of species over time. And the red list index has been adopted by the Biodiversity Convention, several other biodiversity-related conventions, and indeed the Sustainable Development Goals and the UN Statistics Division as a means of monitoring the status of life on Earth. So the red list is itself the means that we will know whether we've achieved success. We will be able to measure that. Now, in terms of the goal we're calling for extinction risk in species to be 0 by 2050 and to show good progress towards that by 2030, reduced by 20% by 2030. But to do this, we're going to require all the kind of conservation actions that I referred to earlier, and we're going to require this very, very strong framework to galvanize action to save our life support system.
Thank you, Jane. We have one final question from online. I promised we have to take at least one. We'll be around, so you can ask questions right after. This is from Context in France, and they are asking whether marine ecosystems are even more threatened than others. And I think David can take that one.
So just to try and answer that briefly, it's hard to say if marine ecosystems are more threatened than terrestrial ecosystems with all the pressures. The ocean is much larger. One thing that is emerging is that with climate change, climatic belts are moving away from the equator towards the poles, and this is happening perhaps 5 times faster in marine ecosystems than on terrestrial ones. So this impact of climate migration and forced movement that species and ecosystems may have to follow might be faster in the ocean than on land.
Thank you, David. Thank you all very much for coming. We have to free the room for the next press conference. You find the press release at the QR code as well as photos, our email address. We will be just here off the back. So if you have questions, please come find us. Thank you very much.
How can I find species related to Canada, this region?
a view where you can filter by